Miss Marple and the brass band competition murder. Welcome to Velvet Clues. I'm your host Connor, and I'm delighted you've joined us today for another intriguing mystery from the archives of St. Mary Mead. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know your location. It always warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. Now, settle in with your favourite warm beverage and let me tell you about the time Miss Marple unravelled a murder most musical. Chapter 1. A Fatal Rehearsal at the County Hall. The first Saturday of November had dawned crisp and clear over St. Mary Mead, the sort of autumn day that made Miss Jane Marple grateful for her warm woolen coat as she made her way to the County Hall. The village brass band was competing in the regional championships for the first time in 3 decades, and the entire community had turned out to support their musicians. Miss Marple settled into her seat in the observation gallery, her knitting bag beside her, prepared to enjoy an afternoon of musical competition. The St. Mary Mead brass band had assembled on stage for their final rehearsal before their 2 o'clock performance slot. Miss Marple observed them with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had watched many of these musicians grow from enthusiastic children into accomplished performers. There was Thomas Wright on second euphonium, a retired gentleman who had moved to the village 3 years ago and quickly become an integral part of the band. Beside him sat Marcus Thornfield, the brilliant new first-chair euphonium player whose arrival 6 months earlier had transformed the band's prospects entirely. Mr. Thornfield was a striking figure, tall and elegant with prematurely silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to success. His playing was extraordinary, technically flawless, with a rich tone that elevated every piece the band performed. Under his influence, the St. Mary Mead band had improved dramatically, and today they had a genuine chance at the championship trophy that had eluded them for so long. The band director, Mrs. Patricia Ashworth, raised her baton to begin the rehearsal. The opening bars of their competition piece filled the hall, and Miss Marple found herself transported by the music's beauty. Then came the moment for Mr. Thornfield's solo, a challenging euphonium passage that showcased his remarkable talent. He lifted his instrument, positioned the mouthpiece, and began to play. The notes soared through the hall with crystalline clarity. Suddenly Mr. Thornfield faltered, his face contorted with pain, and the euphonium slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the stage floor. He clutched at his throat, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. Mrs. Ashworth dropped her baton and rushed to his side, calling desperately for help. Other band members crowded around as Mr. Thornfield collapsed completely, his body convulsing with violent spasms. Miss Marple rose from her seat, her keen mind already noting details that others might overlook. The precise timing of the collapse, the specific symptoms Mr. Thornfield displayed, the way his illness had manifested only after he began playing. Dr. Haydock pushed through the gathering crowd, his medical bag already open, but Miss Marple could see from his grave expression that there was little to be done. Within minutes, Marcus Thornfield was dead, and the joyous atmosphere of the competition had transformed into something far more sinister. Chapter 2. The Poisoned Mouthpiece. The county hall had been cleared of spectators, leaving only the St. Mary Mead band members, competition officials, and Inspector Slack, who had arrived with commendable speed after Dr. Haydock's urgent telephone call. Miss Marple remained in the observation gallery, her knitting needles moving with steady rhythm while her sharp eyes missed nothing of the scene unfolding below. She had seen death before, too many times in her long life, and she recognized immediately that Marcus Thornfield's symptoms suggested something far more sinister than natural causes. Dr. Haydock emerged from his examination looking deeply troubled. Inspector Slack listened to his report with growing concern, occasionally glancing up toward where Miss Marple sat quietly observing. She knew that look. The inspector had learned, however reluctantly, to value her insights into the darker aspects of human nature that sometimes manifested in their peaceful village. After a brief consultation, Inspector Slack approached the observation gallery. His expression suggested a man torn between professional skepticism and hard-won respect for Miss Marple's peculiar talents. She set down her knitting and regarded him with calm, intelligent eyes that had witnessed far more than most people suspected. The inspector explained what Dr. Haydock had discovered. Mr. Thornfield's symptoms, the rapid progression of his illness, and certain physical indicators all pointed toward ricin poisoning. This was no common poison, Inspector Slack emphasized, but a sophisticated toxin derived from castor beans, requiring specialized knowledge to extract and prepare. More significantly, ricin was a delayed-action poison. Mr. Thornfield must have been exposed hours earlier, meaning the killer had calculated precisely when symptoms would appear. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already working through the implications. The precision required for such a murder was remarkable. The killer needed to know exactly when Mr. Thornfield would be exposed to the poison, understand ricin's delayed effects well enough to time the symptoms for maximum impact, and have access to both the extraordinarily difficult-to-obtain toxin and Mr. Thornfield's euphonium. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity, but of careful, calculated planning. The inspector revealed that preliminary examination of Mr. Thornfield's euphonium had found traces of ricin on the mouthpiece. The poison had been applied in such a way that Mr. Thornfield would absorb it through the mucous membranes of his lips and mouth when he played. Given ricin's delayed action, whoever poisoned the mouthpiece must have done so earlier that morning, knowing that Mr. Thornfield would first play during the afternoon rehearsal. Miss Marple asked quietly whether Mr. Thornfield had a regular routine before performances. Inspector Slack consulted his notes and confirmed that, according to other band members, Mr. Thornfield was meticulous about his pre-competition preparations. He always arrived early, cleaned and prepared his euphonium in exactly the same way, and typically played warm-up exercises precisely 3 hours before any performance. This information troubled Miss Marple considerably. If the killer knew Mr. Thornfield's routine, they would have expected him to practice at 11 o'clock that morning, giving the ricin 6 hours to take effect before the 2 o'clock performance. Instead, Mr. Thornfield had collapsed almost immediately upon playing during the rehearsal. Something had disrupted the killer's carefully calculated timeline. Chapter 3. The Glory Hunter's Pattern. The brass band members had been moved to a waiting room where Inspector Slack could interview them individually. Miss Marple, with the inspector's grudging permission, had positioned herself in an adjacent room where she could observe through a partially open door. She understood that grief and shock often loosen tongues, revealing truths that might otherwise remain hidden beneath polite conversation. Thomas Wright, the second-chair euphonium player, was among the first to be interviewed. He was a distinguished-looking gentleman in his early 60s, with careful movements and a quiet, measured way of speaking. When Inspector Slack asked about his relationship with Mr. Thornfield, Wright's composure slipped momentarily, revealing something darker beneath his civilized exterior. Wright explained that he had held the first euphonium chair for 2 years before Mr. Thornfield's arrival. The demotion to second chair had been humiliating, though Wright claimed to have accepted it gracefully for the good of the band. However, his tone suggested otherwise. There was bitterness there, carefully controlled but unmistakable to anyone listening closely. More significantly, Wright revealed that he had researched Mr. Thornfield's background and discovered a troubling pattern. Over the past 5 years, Thornfield had joined 4 different amateur brass bands, always shortly before major competitions. In each case, his brilliant playing had helped the band achieve success, and in each case, Thornfield had immediately left afterward to pursue professional opportunities that his amateur success had created. Wright used the term glory hunter with particular venom, explaining that this was brass band slang for musicians who exploited community bands as stepping stones to professional careers. Miss Marple listened with keen interest as Wright described how he had tried to warn the other band members about Thornfield's pattern. No one had believed him. They were too excited about finally having a chance at the championship trophy, too dazzled by Thornfield's talent to consider that he might be using them. Wright's frustration was palpable as he recounted how his warnings had been dismissed as jealousy from a demoted musician. Inspector Slack asked whether Wright had any proof of Thornfield's intentions. Wright hesitated, then admitted that he had discovered something significant just 2 weeks ago. Through contacts in the professional brass band world, he had learned that Thornfield had already accepted a position with a prestigious professional ensemble, starting the week after the competition. Thornfield had been planning to abandon St. Mary Mead's band all along, never intending to stay beyond the single competition that would enhance his professional credentials. The inspector made careful notes while Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm. She was thinking about the specialized knowledge required to extract and prepare ricin, the meticulous timing involved in the poisoning, and the deep resentment that Wright had just revealed. There was something here that warranted further investigation, some detail about Wright's background that might prove significant. When Wright mentioned that several other band members shared his anger about Thornfield's exploitation, Miss Marple made a mental note to observe their interviews carefully. Mrs. Patricia Ashworth, the band director who had spent decades building the ensemble only to watch an outsider receive credit for their success. The two longtime members who felt betrayed by Thornfield's mercenary approach to amateur music. Each had potential motive, but Miss Marple's instincts told her that Wright himself warranted the closest scrutiny. Chapter 4. The Pharmaceutical Researcher's Garden. Sunday morning found Miss Marple taking what appeared to be a casual stroll through St. Mary Mead, though her route had been planned with characteristic precision. She had spent the previous evening in quiet contemplation, her knitting providing cover, while her mind worked through the various elements of Marcus Thornfield's murder. Ricin poisoning required sophisticated knowledge, the sort that did not come from casual reading or amateur chemistry. Her seemingly aimless wanderings brought her past Thomas Wright's cottage, a neat property on the village outskirts with an exceptionally well-maintained garden. Miss Marple paused to admire a particularly striking bed of autumn flowers, taking the opportunity to survey Wright's horticultural choices. What she observed confirmed her growing suspicions. Among the ornamental plants, carefully tended and clearly cultivated with expertise, were several specimens of ricinus, communis, commonly known as castor bean plants. These were legal to grow for decorative purposes, their large palmate leaves and striking seed pods making them popular with gardeners. However, it was highly unusual for someone to cultivate them so deliberately, in such quantity, unless they had specific interest in the plant's more notorious properties. Miss Marple continued her walk, nodding pleasantly to neighbours while her mind catalogued additional observations. Wright's cottage featured a substantial garden shed, larger than typically necessary for routine gardening equipment. Through the partially open door, she glimpsed what appeared to be considerably more sophisticated equipment than one might expect for simple horticulture. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Mrs. Ashworth, the band director, who was seeking comfort and counsel in the aftermath of the tragedy. Over tea in Miss Marple's sitting room, the conversation turned to Thomas Wright and his background before moving to St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Ashworth revealed that Wright had been a pharmaceutical researcher before his retirement. He had spent his career working with plant-derived compounds, specifically toxins and their medical applications. His expertise had been in extracting and purifying complex organic molecules from natural sources. Mrs. Ashworth mentioned this almost casually as evidence of Wright's distinguished background, clearly unaware of how significant this information might be. Miss Marple encouraged Mrs. Ashworth to continue and learned that Wright's retirement 3 years ago had been somewhat earlier than expected. Mrs. Ashworth understood it had been related to a dispute with a research partner, though Wright rarely discussed the details. He had come to St. Mary Mead seeking peace and community after what had apparently been a difficult conclusion to his professional life. When Mrs. Ashworth departed, Miss Marple sat for a long time in contemplative silence. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a coherent picture. Wright possessed exactly the specialized knowledge necessary to extract ricin from castor beans. His garden contained the source material, his shed likely contained the equipment needed for the extraction process, and his resentment toward Thornfield was evident and deeply felt. However, Miss Marple sensed there was something more, some deeper wound that had transformed Wright's understandable frustration into homicidal intent. Men did not commit sophisticated, carefully planned murders simply because they had been demoted in an amateur brass band. There must be something in Wright's past, some previous trauma that Thornfield's exploitation had triggered, pushing Wright beyond the boundaries of civilized restraint. Chapter 5. The Calculation Error. Monday morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage, looking considerably more receptive to her insights than he typically did at the beginning of investigations. He had spent the previous day interviewing band members and reviewing evidence, and had arrived at many of the same conclusions that Miss Marple's quiet observations had already suggested. The inspector confirmed that security footage from the county hall showed Thomas Wright accessing the instrument storage area at 6 o'clock Saturday morning, 3 hours before other band members arrived. Wright claimed he had come early to practice in private, something he occasionally did before important performances. However, there was no footage of him actually practicing, and the timeline aligned perfectly with when the ricin must have been applied to Thornfield's mouthpiece. Miss Marple listened carefully, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. She asked whether the inspector had examined Wright's background in any detail. Inspector Slack consulted his notes and confirmed that Wright had indeed been a pharmaceutical researcher, with specific expertise in plant-derived toxins. He had worked for a major pharmaceutical company for nearly 30 years before his abrupt retirement. The inspector had also obtained a warrant to search Wright's property. The garden shed contained sophisticated chemical extraction equipment, far beyond anything necessary for normal gardening activities. Wright claimed the equipment was for plant-based art projects, extracting natural dyes and pigments for use in botanical illustrations. However, the specific configuration of the apparatus matched precisely what would be needed to extract and purify ricin from castor beans. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the inspector with her calm, intelligent gaze. She explained her theory about the calculation error. Wright had expected Thornfield to follow his normal routine of warming up 3 hours before the performance. At that rate, with Thornfield practicing at 11 o'clock, the carefully calculated dose of ricin would have taken effect gradually, with symptoms emerging subtly during the actual 2 o'clock performance, creating maximum embarrassment as Thornfield's playing deteriorated in front of judges and competitors. However, Miss Marple had learned from Mrs. Ashworth that Thornfield had been unusually stressed that morning and had skipped his normal warm-up routine entirely. He had not touched his euphonium until the rehearsal itself. This meant the ricin dose, calculated to act over 6 hours, had instead hit Thornfield's system within minutes of exposure, creating the acute, dramatic reaction they had witnessed rather than the subtle, gradual decline Wright had apparently intended. Inspector Slack absorbed this information with growing recognition of its significance. The calculation error suggested sophisticated planning combined with imperfect execution. It demonstrated that Wright had intended not just murder, but public humiliation, timing Thornfield's collapse to occur during the actual performance in front of the entire brass band community. Thornfield had been exploiting. The inspector revealed one additional piece of evidence. Analysis of the poisoned mouthpiece showed that the ricin had been applied in a specific pattern, concentrated on the areas where Thornfield's lips would make contact. This was not random poisoning, but precisely targeted application, demonstrating intimate knowledge of how brass instruments were played and where toxins would be most effectively absorbed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Everything pointed toward Wright as the killer. However, she remained troubled by the question of deeper motivation. What had transformed a civilized, educated man into someone capable of such calculated murder? Chapter 6. The Stolen Research and Professional Betrayal. The answer to Miss Marple's question emerged gradually over the following days, pieced together from various sources like fragments of a shattered mirror slowly reassembled. Inspector Slack, following Miss Marple's suggestion that Wright's past might hold the key to understanding his present actions, had investigated the circumstances surrounding Wright's retirement from pharmaceutical research. What he discovered painted a picture of professional devastation far more severe than anyone in St. Mary Mead had realized. 15 years ago, Thomas Wright had been conducting groundbreaking research into plant-derived treatments for various medical conditions. He had spent years developing extraction techniques and testing protocols, working in partnership with a colleague named Dr. Richard Pemberton. Together, they had been on the verge of a significant breakthrough. Then Pemberton had betrayed him. Using Wright's research notes and laboratory work, Pemberton had published their findings under his own name, claiming sole credit for discoveries that were primarily Wright's achievement. By the time Wright realized what had happened, Pemberton had already secured patents, founded a pharmaceutical company, and built a highly successful business based entirely on work that Wright had done. Wright had attempted legal action, but the case had been complicated by the informal nature of their collaboration and Pemberton's careful destruction of evidence showing Wright's primary role. The lawsuit had dragged on for years, ultimately settling with no admission of wrongdoing and a confidentiality agreement that prevented Wright from discussing the details publicly. His career had been destroyed, his reputation damaged by the lengthy legal battle, while Pemberton had gone on to wealth and professional acclaim. Miss Marple learned these details during a quiet conversation with Wright's neighbour, Mrs. Fletcher, who had been Wright's confidant during his difficult adjustment to retirement. Mrs. Fletcher explained with obvious sympathy how Wright had struggled with the injustice of his situation. He had done the work, made the discoveries, but someone else had reaped all the rewards. The betrayal had haunted him for 15 years. When Miss Marple gently inquired how Wright had seemed in recent months, Mrs. Fletcher's expression grew troubled. She admitted that Wright had become increasingly agitated after Marcus Thornfield joined the band. He had spoken obsessively about patterns of exploitation, about talented people being used and discarded, about the unfairness of watching someone achieve success through calculated manipulation of others. Mrs. Fletcher had assumed Wright was simply jealous about being demoted to second chair, but now she wondered whether something deeper had been triggered. Miss Marple understood immediately. Watching Thornfield systematically exploit the St. Mary Mead band, using their dedication and community spirit as a stepping stone to professional success, had awakened Wright's own trauma. In Thornfield's calculated exploitation of amateur musicians, Wright had seen a mirror of Pemberton's exploitation of his research, his years of work, his professional achievements. The parallel had been too much to bear. Inspector Slack, when Miss Marple shared these insights, recognized their significance immediately. Wright had not simply killed Thornfield because of a brass band rivalry. He had been reliving his own victimization, attempting to prevent one more exploitation in a world that had allowed his own career to be stolen without consequence. In stopping Thornfield, he had been symbolically stopping Pemberton, avenging 15-year-old wounds that had never properly healed. Chapter 7. The Documentation of Exploitation. Inspector Slack's formal interrogation of Thomas Wright took place on Tuesday afternoon in the small interview room at the local police station. Miss Marple was not present, of course, but the inspector later shared with her the remarkable nature of Wright's confession, which had been both complete and deeply disturbing in its implications. Wright had admitted everything immediately, displaying none of the evasion or denial that typically characterize guilty parties. Instead, he had been almost eager to explain his actions, as though finally having an opportunity to justify the careful planning that had gone into Marcus Thornfield's murder. He had produced extensive documentation, files he had compiled over months of research into Thornfield's history in the brass band world. The documentation was extraordinarily thorough. Wright had contacted members of the 4 previous bands Thornfield had joined and abandoned. He had collected testimony from dozens of amateur musicians who described identical patterns. Thornfield would arrive shortly before major competitions, his brilliant playing would elevate the band's performance, and immediately after achieving success, he would depart for professional opportunities that his amateur achievements had created. Each time, he left behind bandmates who felt used and betrayed. Wright had attempted to present this evidence to the St. Mary Mead band members, trying to warn them that Thornfield would abandon them just as he had abandoned every previous ensemble. However, his warnings had been dismissed as jealousy from a demoted musician. The band had been too excited about their championship prospects, too dazzled by Thornfield's talent, to believe that he was simply using them. According to Inspector Slack's account, Wright had explained his reasoning with disturbing calmness. He had argued that he was not committing murder so much as preventing exploitation. Thornfield had already accepted a professional position elsewhere. He would have used the St. Mary Mead band to achieve victory, enhanced his credentials through their championship, and immediately abandoned them without a backward glance. Wright had simply accelerated the inevitable outcome while ensuring that Thornfield could not use their community's dedication as his personal stepping stone. Wright had been particularly eloquent about the broader issue of exploitation in amateur music. Brass bands were community institutions built through years of dedication by ordinary people who loved music. When talented outsiders used these institutions purely for personal advancement, they damaged something precious, some sense of shared purpose and community spirit that could not easily be restored. Wright had seen himself as protecting that spirit, even if his methods were extreme. However, Wright had also acknowledged the deeper psychological dimensions of his actions. He recognized that watching Thornfield exploit the band had triggered traumatic memories of his own professional betrayal. He admitted that his response had not been entirely rational. that somewhere in his planning he had confused Thornfield with Pemberton, the research partner who had destroyed his career. He had been simultaneously preventing Thornfield's exploitation and symbolically avenging his own victimization, two motivations tangled together in ways he himself could not entirely separate. Miss Marple, hearing this account, understood both the tragedy and the complexity of Wright's situation. He had committed calculated murder using sophisticated chemical knowledge, demonstrating clear premeditation and rational planning. Yet he had also been driven by unresolved trauma, experiencing what might legitimately be characterized as a psychological break triggered by watching exploitation similar to what he had suffered. Chapter 8. The castor bean extraction process. Wednesday morning brought additional revelations as forensic analysis confirmed the sophisticated nature of Wright's poisoning method. Dr. Haydock, who had been consulting with toxicology specialists, explained to Miss Marple and Inspector Slack the remarkable precision with which the ricin had been extracted and prepared. Castor beans naturally contained ricin, but in a form that was relatively benign when ingested whole. The truly dangerous toxin required extraction through a multi-stage chemical process involving grinding, soaking, filtering, and chemical treatment to concentrate and purify the active poison. The process was well documented in pharmaceutical literature, but required specialized equipment, chemical reagents, and considerable expertise to execute successfully. The ricin recovered from Thornfield's euphonium mouthpiece had been exceptionally pure, suggesting that Wright had used professional-grade techniques refined during his pharmaceutical career. More significantly, the dosage had been calculated with remarkable precision. Wright had attempted to deliver exactly the amount needed to produce symptoms after 6 hours of exposure, timing that would have caused Thornfield to deteriorate gradually during the actual competition performance. The calculation error, caused by Thornfield's decision to skip his morning warm-up, had been the only flaw in an otherwise perfectly executed poisoning. Wright had assumed Thornfield would follow his invariable routine of practicing 3 hours before performances. When Thornfield instead first played at the rehearsal itself, the carefully calculated 6-hour dose had instead produced acute symptoms within minutes, creating the dramatic public death that Wright had witnessed. Inspector Slack had obtained a warrant to search Wright's cottage more thoroughly. In the garden shed, forensic specialists had found not only the extraction equipment, but also Wright's detailed laboratory notebook, documenting his ricin preparation process. The notebook entries spanned 3 months, showing how Wright had carefully cultivated his castor bean plants, harvested the beans, and systematically extracted and purified the toxin. Each step had been recorded with the meticulous attention to detail of a trained research scientist. Most disturbingly, the notebook included precise calculations of dosage, absorption rates through mucous membranes, and symptom onset timelines. Wright had been conducting what amounted to theoretical murder planning, using his pharmaceutical expertise to design a poisoning that would produce maximum humiliation for Thornfield, while appearing to be a tragic accident or natural death. Miss Marple observed that Wright's scientific approach to murder revealed both his professional background and his psychological state. The careful documentation, the precise calculations, the methodical extraction process, all suggested someone applying rational, learned skills to an irrational goal. Wright had committed a crime of passion using the tools of dispassionate scientific research. Dr. Haydock added one additional observation. The application method Wright had chosen, coating a brass instrument mouthpiece with toxin, demonstrated intimate knowledge of both musical practice and poison delivery. Wright would have known that brass players regularly moistened their lips, that they achieved tight seals against mouthpieces through sustained pressure, and that these factors would ensure efficient toxin absorption. His method had been as elegant as it was deadly. Chapter 9. The Confrontation and Deeper Truth. Thursday afternoon brought the final confrontation between Miss Marple and Thomas Wright. Inspector Slack had arranged for Miss Marple to visit Wright in custody, hoping that her gentle questioning might extract additional details about his motivations and planning. Wright had agreed to the meeting, apparently welcoming the opportunity to explain his actions to someone who might understand their complexity. Miss Marple found Wright in a small interview room, looking considerably older than he had appeared before his arrest. The careful grooming and dignified bearing that had characterized him as a band member had given way to disheveled exhaustion, as though maintaining his civilized facade had required more energy than he could now muster. Wright began by acknowledging his guilt completely. He had applied ricin to Thornfield's mouthpiece Saturday morning, calculating the dose to produce symptoms during the afternoon performance. He had intended not just to kill Thornfield, but to humiliate him, to ensure that Thornfield's final act would be public failure in front of the brass band community he had been exploiting. However, as Wright continued speaking, Miss Marple detected something beyond simple confession. Wright was seeking not just to explain his actions, but to justify them, to persuade her that he had been protecting his community from exploitation. He spoke eloquently about amateur music's importance, about how community bands represented something precious that deserved protection from mercenary outsiders who used them as career stepping stones. Miss Marple listened with her characteristic patience, allowing Wright to exhaust his initial explanations before gently probing deeper. She asked about his pharmaceutical career, about the research partnership that had ended so painfully, about the 15 years he had spent processing professional betrayal. Wright's careful composure began to crack as he confronted these older wounds. The truth emerged gradually, painfully. Wright admitted that watching Thornfield exploit the band had triggered something in him that went beyond rational response. He had been reliving his own victimization, experiencing Pemberton's betrayal again through the parallel circumstances. In his mind, stopping Thornfield had become confused with stopping Pemberton, preventing the exploitation that had destroyed his career. Wright described experiencing a kind of psychological break during the weeks before the murder. He had known intellectually that Thornfield was not Pemberton, that poisoning Thornfield would not undo the theft of his research 15 years ago. Yet emotionally, the distinction had become blurred. He had been simultaneously acting in the present and attempting to rewrite the past, preventing one exploitation while symbolically avenging another. Miss Marple asked whether Wright had considered other responses to Thornfield's behavior. Wright admitted that he had briefly contemplated simply exposing Thornfield's pattern to the band, ensuring that everyone knew about the impending abandonment. However, he had already tried warning them and been dismissed. He had convinced himself that only dramatic action would prevent the exploitation, that merely revealing Thornfield's intentions would not stop him from using the band. The conversation turned to the ricin itself and the sophisticated knowledge required to prepare it. Wright acknowledged that his pharmaceutical background had made the murder possible in ways it would not have been for ordinary people. He had possessed not just the chemical expertise, but also the equipment and the understanding of delayed-action poisons necessary to execute his plan. His scientific training had provided the means to express emotions he could no longer contain through civilized channels. Chapter 10. Justice and the Weight of Exploitation. The trial of Thomas Wright began in late November and concluded within a week, as trials often did when the defendant offered full confession and the evidence was overwhelming. Miss Marple attended each day, seated in the public gallery with her knitting, observing the legal system's attempt to impose order on events that defied simple categorization. Wright's defense attorney argued for diminished capacity, presenting psychiatric evidence that Wright had suffered a psychological break triggered by trauma related to his past professional betrayal. Expert witnesses testified about post-traumatic stress, about how unresolved victimization could create situations where rational individuals acted in deeply irrational ways. The defense portrayed Wright as someone whose judgment had been temporarily impaired by the psychological re-experiencing of previous trauma. The prosecution countered with evidence of Wright's sophisticated planning and execution. The 3 months of systematic preparation, the careful cultivation of castor beans, the meticulous extraction of ricin, the precise calculation of dosage, all demonstrated rational, goal-directed behavior inconsistent with psychological incapacity. Wright had known exactly what he was doing, had understood the consequences, and had proceeded with scientific precision to accomplish murder. The jury's verdict reflected this tension. Wright was found guilty of premeditated murder, the evidence of planning too overwhelming to support diminished capacity defense. However, in their sentencing recommendation, the jury acknowledged mitigating factors related to Wright's past victimization and the triggering circumstances of Thornfield's exploitation. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, addressed the broader issues the case had raised. He acknowledged that Thomas Wright had been genuinely wronged 15 years ago, that the theft of his research represented serious professional misconduct that should have been punished, but had been inadequately addressed by legal systems designed to protect intellectual property rather than individual researchers. However, past victimization could never justify present murder, regardless of how similar the triggering circumstances might seem. The judge also addressed the brass band community directly, noting that while Marcus Thornfield had committed no crimes, his pattern of exploiting amateur musicians for professional advancement raised ethical questions about how community institutions protected themselves from exploitation. Amateur organizations that allowed themselves to be used as stepping stones bore some responsibility for creating conditions where resentment could fester into violence. Thomas Wright received a life sentence with possibility of parole after 20 years, a sentence that reflected both the severity of premeditated murder and recognition of mitigating circumstances related to his psychological state. As he was led from the courtroom, Wright turned toward where Miss Marple sat and nodded slightly, acknowledging perhaps that she alone had truly understood the complexity of his motivations. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage reflecting on the case's troubling dimensions. Wright had committed sophisticated, calculated murder, yet had been driven by trauma and protective instincts toward his community. Thornfield had been exploitative, but had broken no laws. The brass band world had enabled exploitation through informal practices that disadvantaged amateur musicians, but served talented individuals seeking professional advancement. The case raised questions that admitted no easy answers. Could communities that allowed exploitation bear responsibility when victims retaliated violently? Did past trauma justify or merely explain present violence? How should society balance protecting community institutions against talented individuals' rights to use available opportunities for advancement? Wright's psychiatric condition complicated rather than resolved these questions, forcing recognition that human behavior emerged from tangles of rationality and irrationality, justice and trauma that defied simple legal or moral categorization. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the steady rhythm providing comfort as she contemplated these enduring mysteries of human nature.